I stared at the $2 million diamond necklace planted in my flight jacket and realized my life was over. My daughter was screaming as the dard slammed me against the freezing hangar floor, all while the billionaire I'd just saved from a burning wreck watched with ice in her eyes. I had two choices: rot in a cell for a crime I didn't commit, or reveal the terrifying secret I'd been hiding since the day my wife died. But if I told the truth, there was no going back. Would you sacrifice your freedom to keep a promise to a dead woman, or let the person who tried to kill you win? You need to see how this ends, because the person who framed me is standing right behind you. If this story resonates with you, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, Lucas and I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one. You don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. The air in the private hangar at Aspen Pitkin was thin and tasted of kerosene and impending snow. Lucas Bennett adjusted his pilot's cap, the worn leather of his gloves a stark contrast to the gleaming $60 million Gulfstream G650 parked before him. Beside him, 6-year-old Sophie huddled into his side, her small hand buried in the pocket of his flight jacket. "Is the big plane going to wait for Santa, Daddy?" she whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the ground crew scramble. "Santa knows exactly where to find us, Soph," Lucas said, offering a calm, practiced smile. Inside, however, his heart was a lead weight. He needed this holiday bonus. Since Sophie's mother had passed, every cent went toward the mortgage and the specialized tutoring Sophie needed for her dyslexia. Before we continue, tell me, what would you do if a boss insulted your child? Would you stay quiet to keep your job, or would you walk away? Let me know in the comments. The sound of clicking heels and the heavy thud of designer luggage announced the arrival of the Valerius siblings. Julian Valerius led the way, draped in a shearling coat that cost more than Lucas made in a year. Behind him walked Vespera Valerius. She was striking, her presence commanding the entire hangar. Her long, dark hair was tucked into the collar of a tailored wool coat that accentuated her hourglass figure, and her eyes, though beautiful, were as cold as the frost creeping across the hangar windows. "Bennett!" Julian shouted, not bothering to look at Lucas. "Why aren't the engines cycling? We were supposed to be wheels up 10 minutes ago. My sister has a gala in New York, and I have a bottle of Cristal with my name on it." Lucas stepped forward, his posture professional and tall. "Mr. Valerius, the Weather Service just issued a red cell warning for the pass. We need to wait 45 minutes for the de-icing truck and for the wind shear to die down. It's a matter of safety." Julian stopped, turning slowly. He looked at Lucas's boots, then at Sophie, who shrank behind her father's leg. "Safety? I pay you to fly, not to read weather reports. I have a schedule. Vespera, tell this peasant to get on the plane." Vespera stepped forward, her gaze landing on Lucas. She didn't look at him like a man. She looked at him like a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "Is there a problem, Captain Bennett?" Her voice was low, melodic, but lacked any hint of warmth. "The storm is intensifying, Ms. Valerius," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "I won't risk the lives of my passengers or my co-pilot, especially not on Christmas Eve." Julian scoffed, stepping into Lucas's personal space. He reached out and flicked the frayed patch on Lucas's shoulder. "Look at you. You're a glorified bus driver in a hand-me-down suit. And what is this?" He pointed at Sophie. "You brought a brat to a billionaire's flight? This isn't a daycare. It's a professional service." "She's my daughter," Lucas said. His tone dropped an octave. "My sitter's pipes froze. She's staying in the jump seat, out of the way. It's been cleared by the terminal manager."
"I don't care if she's the Queen of Sheba," Julian spat. He took his half-finished espresso and, with a smirk, poured the lukewarm brown liquid over Lucas's polished black shoes. "You're incompetent, you're late, and you're pathetic. You're fired, Bennett. Hand over the keys to the jet, now." The hangar went silent. Lucas felt Sophie's hand tremble. He looked at Vespera, hoping for a shred of logic. She simply adjusted her leather gloves. "My brother is right about the delay, Captain. We cannot afford it. If you won't fly, we'll find someone who will. Leave the terminal immediately." Lucas's jaw tightened. He could feel the justified rage simmering, but he looked down at Sophie. He wouldn't let her see him break. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out the key fob for the G650, and dropped it into the puddle of coffee at Julian's feet. "The pass is closed for a reason, Julian," Lucas said quietly. "I hope your champagne is worth what's coming." He picked up Sophie, tucked her head into his shoulder, and walked out into the biting wind, leaving the warmth of the hangar behind. The heater in Lucas's 1998 Ford F-150 groaned like a dying beast, struggling to push a thin stream of lukewarm air against the encroaching mountain frost. He sat in the driver's seat, his jaw still tight, staring through the cracked windshield as the gold-liveried Valerius jet taxied toward the runway. They had found a pilot, likely some desperate freelancer willing to trade safety for a heavy envelope of cash. "Daddy, are we going home now?" Sophie asked, her voice small. She was shivering, despite the heavy blanket he'd wrapped around her. "Soon, Soph," Lucas said, his voice thick. He reached into the glove box to find a candy bar he'd hidden for an emergency, but his fingers brushed against something else instead. A heavy, bronze coin. He pulled it out, the metal cold against his palm. It was his old unit's challenge coin from his time as a lead search and rescue commander for the Coast Guard's elite Arctic Shadows unit. Before he was a glorified bus driver, Lucas Bennett was the man the government called when the weather became a weapon. He was the only pilot to ever receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for a night extraction in a Category 4 hurricane. He'd retired to give Sophie a stable life, a life away from the smell of burning wreckage and the sound of grieving families. But the skills, the instincts, were still there, buried under his humble exterior. Suddenly, a thunderous roar shook the truck. Lucas watched as the Valerius jet surged down the runway, disappearing into the white wall of the storm. He checked his watch. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than he'd ever seen. "They are fools," he whispered. He reached for his phone, intending to call the tower and lodge one final protest, but his screen flashed with a news alert. State of emergency declared. All mountain passes closed. Military grounded. He looked at the bronze coin again. Just a mile away, in a private, weather-beaten hangar he paid for with his meager savings, sat the Valkyrie, a heavily modified twin-engine Sikorsky he had spent 3 years restoring. It wasn't a luxury toy. It was a tank with rotors, built specifically for the kind of hell that was currently swallowing the Valerius family. "I have to go to the shed, Soph," Lucas said, his eyes hardening. "Is it for the Christmas surprise?" asked Sophie, a spark of hope in her eyes. "In a way," Lucas replied. He wasn't going to let them die, no matter how much Julian deserved a lesson. He wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it because a pilot never leaves people in the sky. As he shifted the truck into gear, he realized the secret he'd kept from this town and from his daughter was about to be the only thing that mattered. He wasn't just a pilot. He was the only man who could survive the night.
The emergency frequency on Lucas's radio didn't just crackle, it screamed. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Gulfstream 79er Victor. We've lost Benjamin 2. Ice ingestion. We're going down. We're over the Silverhorn Ridge. The transmission cut into a deafening roar of static. Lucas stood in his private hangar, the heavy steel doors rattling against the blizzard. He didn't hesitate. He looked at Sophie, who was sitting on a crate, her eyes wide. "Soph, listen to me. I need you to stay in the office, lock the door, keep the space heater on, and do not open it for anyone but me. I have to go help that plane," Lucas said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "The one with the mean man?" she asked. "Everyone deserves to come home for Christmas, Soph, even the mean ones." He kissed her forehead and sprinted toward the shadow at the back of the hangar. He pulled the tarp, revealing the Valkyrie. Minutes later, the heavy thrum of the Sikorsky's rotors beat back the snow. Lucas pushed the machine into the heart of the storm. The wind tried to swat him out of the sky, but he fought it with the muscle memory of a man who had stared death in the face 100 times. On the Silverhorn Ridge, the luxury jet lay snapped in half like a discarded toy. The cabin was a refrigerator of broken glass and expensive upholstery. Vespera Valerius crawled through the snow, her designer coat shredded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Julian lay nearby, pinned under a piece of the bulkhead, screaming in a way that wasn't arrogant anymore. It was pathetic. "Help! Someone!" Vespera cried out, her voice swallowed by the wind. She looked up and saw a ghost, a dark shape descending through the clouds, roaring like a dragon. A searchlight cut through the whiteout, blinding her. The helicopter landed with a bone-jarring thud. A figure jumped out, clad in a heavy flight suit and a blackened helmet. He moved with a precision that was terrifying. He reached Vespera first. He didn't say a word. He simply hoisted her up. "My brother, he's trapped," she sobbed, clutching the stranger's arm. The rescuer turned toward the wreckage. Using a hydraulic pry bar, he wrenched the metal off Julian's legs as if it were cardboard. He dragged Julian toward the helicopter, then came back for Vespera. He lifted her into the heated cabin. As the door hissed shut, blocking out the lethal cold, the rescuer pulled off his helmet. Vespera's heart stopped. The face staring back at her wasn't a peasant or a bus driver. It was Lucas Bennett. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes hard and professional. "Captain Bennett," Vespera whispered, her voice trembling. You came for us?" Lucas didn't look at her. He was already back in the pilot's seat, his hands dancing across the controls. "Sit down, Miss Valerius. Strap in. We're not out of this yet." Julian, clutching his bleeding leg, looked up in horror. You're the one? I'll give you $1 million. Just get me to a hospital." Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Keep your money, Julian. I'm doing this for free. It's Christmas." The storm outside was a physical weight, pounding against the corrugated metal of Lucas's private hangar office. Inside, the space was cramped, smelling of aged paper, machine oil, and the faint, sweet scent of the cinnamon sticks Sophie had insisted on putting in a bowl for Christmas spirit. Vespera sat on a lumpy plaid sofa that had seen better decades, wrapped in a faded quilt that smelled of lavender and laundry soap. Her $4,000 wool coat was a ruined heap on the floor. Across from her, Julian was huddled by a small electric space heater, his face pale, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed stare. He looked small, uncomfortably human without his entourage and his bank balance to shield him. Lucas wasn't looking at them. He was kneeling by a small cot in the corner where Sophie had fallen back into a light sleep. He moved with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man with hands that could wrench open airplane fuselages. He tucked the blanket around her chin, his expression shifting from the hard, tactical mask he'd worn in the cockpit to something raw and vulnerable. "She's okay," Lucas whispered, more to himself than to his guests. "You have a beautiful daughter, Captain," Vespera said, her voice cracking. She looked around the tiny office. There were no gold fixtures, no marble floors. Instead, the walls were covered in Sophie's drawings, lopsided houses and stick-figure versions of Lucas with a cape. In the center of the room stood a tiny, Charlie Brown-style Christmas tree decorated with popcorn strings and hand-painted ornaments. "She's everything," Lucas replied, standing up and wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. He walked over to a small kitchenette and poured 3 mugs of cocoa from a dented pot. He handed one to Vespera. Her fingers brushed his, and she felt a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the liquid. "I have millions in my accounts," Vespera murmured, staring into the dark chocolate. "I have 5 estates across 3 continents, and yet, sitting here in this storm, I realize I've never had a room that felt this warm." Julian scoffed, though it lacked its usual bite. "It's a shed, Vespera. Don't get poetic because you're in shock." Vespera ignored him. her eyes fixed on Lucas. She saw the way his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, the way he looked at the small tree with more pride than she'd seen on a CEO's face after a merger. He was struggling. She could see the overdue notices pinned to a corkboard, but he was rich in a way she couldn't comprehend. "Why did you come back for us?" she asked softly. "After what my brother did? After I stood there and let him do it?" Lucas took a slow sip of his cocoa, the steam fogging his tired eyes. "Because my daughter is watching," he said simply. "I'm raising her to be a good person. It's hard to do that if her father is a man who lets people die out of spite." Vespera felt a pang of shame so sharp it physical. She had spent her life measuring people by their utility. To her, Lucas Bennett had been a tool. To Julian, he was a servant. But here, in the quiet hum of the heater, Lucas Bennett was the only truly powerful person in the room. The blizzard howled like a wounded wolf outside, but inside the small office, the silence was even heavier. Julian had finally drifted into a fitful, pain-filled sleep on the floor, leaving Lucas and Vespera alone by the flickering light of a single desk lamp. Vespera's gaze drifted to a small, silver-framed photo tucked behind a stack of flight manuals. It was a woman with the same bright eyes as Sophie, standing in front of a hospital. "She was beautiful," Vespera said softly. Lucas looked up from a map he was studying. His face softened, the lines of exhaustion deepening. "That's Elena. She was a pediatric surgeon. She spent her life saving kids who didn't have a chance." "What happened?" Lucas looked back at the map, but his eyes were miles away. "A mountain road. 3 years ago. Black ice. I was 3,000 miles away, flying a high-ranking diplomat to a summit in Geneva. I was making a fortune, Vespera. I had the prestige, the titles, the big house." He let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I was in the air, miles above the world, while the only person who mattered was trapped in a ravine. By the time I landed and saw the messages, it was over." He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "I realized then that all the money and important people in the world didn't mean a damn thing if I wasn't there when it mattered. I quit the elite corps, sold everything to pay off her medical debts and the funeral, and moved here. I just wanted to be a dad, a pilot who comes home every night." Vespera felt a lump form in her throat. For her, important people were the only people who existed. I never had to worry about being there for someone," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever realized that the things you were chasing weren't the things that actually mattered? Tell me about a time you had an awakening in the comments." "My father," Vespera said, her eyes fixed on the tiny popcorn-covered tree. "He used to say that people were either assets or liabilities. If you weren't producing, you were a waste of space. When my mother died, he didn't even go to the funeral. He was closing a deal in Hong Kong. He told me that crying was a resource drain." She looked at her hands, still stained with soot from the crash. "I've spent my whole life trying to be an asset. I became cold because I thought it was the only way to be strong. I looked at people like you and saw numbers. I forgot that there's a heart behind the uniform." Lucas looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the cracks in the diamond. She wasn't just a billionaire lead. She was a woman who had been raised in a golden cage, taught that love was a transaction. "You're not a number, Vespera," Lucas said, his voice low and steady. "And you're not your brother's mistakes. But out here, in the cold, assets and liabilities don't exist, just people. And right now, we're the only people we've got." For the first time in her life, Vespera didn't feel like a CEO. She felt like a person. The tension that had defined their first meeting was replaced by a fragile, quiet understanding. Class differences were melting away, leaving only two souls seeking warmth in the middle of a frozen wasteland. The first light of Christmas morning didn't come with a sunrise. Instead, the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray, filtering through the frost-thickened windows of the hangar office. The storm had reached a temporary, eerie lull. Sophie was the first to wake.
She sat up on her cot, rubbing her eyes, her gaze immediately landing on the tiny, sparse tree. "Is it Christmas, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice hopeful yet tentative. Lucas, who had spent the night sitting upright in a wooden chair to keep watch, stood with a groan of stiff muscles. "It is, Soph. Merry Christmas." He looked over at Vespera. She was awake, sitting on the edge of the sofa. Her hair, usually a perfect sculpted mane, was slightly tousled, falling over one shoulder in a way that made her look softer, more accessible. She looked at Sophie and then at the meager pile of gifts Lucas had managed to pull together, a hand-carved wooden plane he'd been working on and a book from the local thrift store. "We have to make Christmas breakfast," Lucas said, his voice husky. "It's tradition." He moved to the small kitchenette. Vespera stood up, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. "Can I help?" Lucas looked at her, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You ever flipped a pancake on an electric griddle, Miss Valerius?" "I've never flipped a pancake on anything, Captain," she admitted, a rare, self-deprecating spark in her eyes. "But I'm a quick study." For the next hour, the social chasm between them vanished. In the tiny, cramped kitchen, they moved in a choreographed dance. Lucas mixed the batter, while Vespera, with focused intensity, took over the toast station. At one point, she burned a slice, and the smoke detector gave a sharp chirp. She jumped, laughing, a real melodic sound that seemed to brighten the dim room. "I think I've just devalued your kitchen," she joked, holding up the blackened bread. "It's okay," Lucas laughed, stepping closer to take the tongs from her. "I like it extra crispy." As they worked, Sophie sat at the small table, showing Vespera how to make a snow globe out of a mason jar and some glitter. For a moment, watching Vespera's long, elegant fingers help Sophie glue a plastic reindeer to the lid, Lucas forgot she was a woman who owned the sky. She looked like she belonged there, in the warmth of his small world. Julian groaned from the floor, stirring awake. He watched the scene with a sour expression, his eyes narrowing as he saw his sister, the cold, calculating Vespera, actually smiling at a man who made less in a year than he spent on wine. "Vespera, stop playing house," hissed Julian, clutching his bandaged leg. "This is pathetic. As soon as the wind drops, we're calling the corporate extraction team. I want this man arrested for kidnapping, not served breakfast." Vespera's smile didn't just fade, it turned to ice when she looked at her brother. "He saved your life, Julian. He's the only reason you're not a frozen corpse on Silverhorn Ridge. Show some dignity." She turned back to Lucas, and for a fleeting second, her hand touched his arm, a lingering, warm pressure. "Thank you, Lucas, for everything." In that quiet moment, amidst the smell of burnt toast and the glow of a $5 string of lights, a bond was forged. It was fragile, built on the shared survival of a long night, but it felt more real to Lucas than any contract he'd ever signed.
The roar of a twin-turbine Bell 525 Relentless drowned out the dying gasps of the storm. It wasn't a rescue, it was an invasion. 4 men in tactical gear with the Valerius corporate insignia dropped from the hovering craft before it even touched the snow. Julian, suddenly filled with a manic energy, hobbled toward the door, waving his arms. "Over here! About damn time!" As the security team swept into the hangar, Lucas stood protectively in front of Sophie. The warmth of the morning vanished, replaced by the clinical, sharp efficiency of the ultra-rich. The lead guard, a man with a face like granite, handed Julian a satellite phone and a warm coat. "Miss Valerius," the guard said, bowing slightly to Vespera, "we're here to extract you. We've already contacted the FAA regarding the pilot's negligence." Vespera frowned, stepping toward Lucas. "Negligence? Captain Bennett saved our lives. He flew into a red cell storm when no one else would." Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. He reached into the pocket of his shearling coat and pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined box, Vespera's $2 million diamond necklace, the one she'd worn for the gala. He held it up, But it wasn't in his hand. He found it by reaching into the pocket of Lucas's flight suit, which was hanging by the door. Saved us or staged it? Julian spat. I found this in your jacket while you two were playing poor person in the kitchen. And look at this. Julian grabbed the stack of overdue notices from the corkboard, waving them in Vespera's face. He's 6 months behind on his mortgage. He's desperate. He knew the storm was coming. He sabotaged the jet's de-icing sensors so we'd be forced down near his little rescue base. Lucas's blood ran cold. That's a lie. I haven't touched your sister's jewelry, and I sure as hell didn't touch your plane. Then how did this get in your pocket, Bennett? Julian sneered. You're a failed pilot looking for a payday. You probably thought you could rescue the heiress, and she'd write you a check for $1 million out of gratitude. Or maybe you were just going to hold us for ransom until the weather cleared. Let's pause here. If you were Vespera, would you believe your own brother and the physical evidence, or would you trust the man who just shared his home and heart with you? Tell us in the comments. The lead guard stepped forward, his hand on his holster. Captain Bennett, you're under citizen's arrest for grand larceny and endangerment. We'll let the authorities handle the kidnapping charges. Lucas looked at Vespera. He didn't look at the guards or the necklace. He looked at the woman who had just laughed with him over burnt toast. Vespera, you know this isn't true. You saw the storm. You saw me out there. Vespera's face was a mask of shock and confusion. She looked at the necklace, then at the desperate, red-inked bills in her brother's hand. The world of corporate betrayal and assets versus liabilities rushed back in, drowning out the memory of the cinnamon scent and the tiny Christmas tree. Vespera's voice faltered. She looked at Sophie, who was clutching Lucas's leg and crying. The necklace. Julian, are you sure? It was in his pocket, Vespera. Wake up. He's a predator, Julian shouted. Vespera looked at Lucas, her eyes filling with a painful, cold distance. She didn't say she believed Julian, but she didn't stop the guards when they stepped toward Lucas. She simply turned away, her silhouette framed by the harsh white light of the rescue helicopter. Take them to the city, she said, her voice sounding dead. I'll handle the statements. As the guards forced Lucas to the ground in front of his screaming daughter, the betrayal felt colder than any blizzard. He had offered his heart, and they had used his poverty as a weapon to break it. The private terminal lounge at Aspen was no longer a place of luxury. It was a courtroom. Reporters clamored outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, their cameras flashing like strobe lights against the night. Inside, Lucas stood with his hands zip-tied behind his back, 2 burly security guards flanking him. Sophie sat on a nearby bench, her eyes red from crying, held by a female officer who looked uncomfortable with the whole ordeal. Julian stood center stage, a bandage on his leg acting as a badge of victimhood. He held the diamond necklace up for a group of corporate lawyers. He's a predator, Julian declared, his voice carrying through the room. He used the storm to trap us. My sister was blinded by a hero act, but the evidence doesn't lie. Vespera stood by the window, her back to the room. She looked smaller than she had in the hangar. The hourglass silhouette was shrouded in a fresh silk wrap, but her presence felt brittle. Vespera? Lucas's voice broke through the noise. It wasn't a plea, it was the command of an SAR officer. Look at me. She turned slowly, her eyes brimming with a mixture of betrayal and grief. You said your father taught you about assets and liabilities, Lucas said, stepping toward her despite the guard's resistance. But did he teach you about black box telemetry? My helicopter, the Valkyrie, isn't a civilian toy. It's an ex-military SAR bird. It has 360-degree internal and external surveillance that uploads to a remote cloud server the moment the rotors engage. Julian's face went from smug to a sickly shade of gray. That's impossible. That old junk pile? Check the server, Vespera, Lucas said, his gaze never leaving hers. Check the internal cabin feed from 6:15 a.m. While you were at the toast station and I was in the cockpit checking the weather, look at what your brother was doing near my flight suit. Vespera didn't hesitate. She grabbed a tablet from one of the lawyers, her fingers flying across the screen. The room went silent as she entered the access codes Lucas recited. The video loaded.
It was grainy but clear. The footage showed the quiet hangar office. Lucas was visible through the cockpit glass, and Vespera was seen in the small kitchenette. Then Julian, limping but mobile, crept toward the coat rack. He reached into his own pocket, pulled out the diamond necklace, and stuffed it deep into the pocket of Lucas's hanging flight jacket. He then looked toward the kitchen, a sneer of pure malice on his face, before hobbling back to his spot on the floor. A gasp rippled through the lawyers. Vespera's breath hitched. But Lucas wasn't done. "Keep watching," Lucas said. "Check the flight logs Julian signed for the Gulfstream yesterday. The ones where he manually overrode the no-go safety sensor on the de-icing system because he didn't want to wait for the truck. He didn't just frame me, Vespera. He's the reason you crashed. He gambled your life for a bottle of champagne at a New York gala." Vespera stared at the screen, watching her brother sabotage her life in high definition. She looked up at Julian, who was backed against a marble pillar, his mouth agape. "Vespera, I was trying to protect the family brand. I didn't think we'd actually crash," Julian stammered. "Protect the brand?" Vespera's voice was a whip crack. She walked over to him, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury he had never seen. She didn't slap him. She did something worse. She took the diamond necklace from the table and dropped it onto the floor. "You are no longer an asset, Julian. You are a liability, and as of this moment, you are removed from the board, the trust, and this family." She turned to the guards, her voice trembling but certain. "Cut the ties, now." The serrated plastic hissed as it was cut. Lucas rubbed his wrists, stepping immediately to Sophie and pulling her into a crushing hug. The public catharsis was complete. The villain was exposed, and the hero, though weary, stood tall. Vespera walked toward Lucas, the press outside going wild as they realized the story was shifting. She stopped inches from him, the silence between them loaded with everything that had been said and unsaid in the storm. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I am so sorry." 1 week later, the mountains were draped in a peaceful, heavy blanket of white. The storm of the century had passed, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean. In a cozy, timber-framed cottage on the outskirts of town, a home Lucas had finally been able to secure thanks to the safety award and back pay settlement from the Valerius Board of Directors, the fire crackled with a steady, rhythmic warmth. Lucas sat on the rug, helping Sophie assemble a complex Lego set. The overdue notices were gone, replaced by a letter of commendation from the FAA and an offer to head a new search and rescue division funded by a private endowment. A soft knock at the door startled them. Lucas stood, his heart doing a strange, familiar skip. He opened the door to find Vespera. She wasn't the icy CEO he'd met in the hangar. She wore a thick, cream-colored sweater and jeans, her long hair loose and windblown. She held a small, beautifully wrapped box. "I didn't want the holidays to end without a proper thank you," she said, her voice lacking any of its former steel. "You don't owe me anything, Vespera," Lucas said, stepping back to let her in. "The board's settlement was more than enough." "The board settled a debt of business," she said, stepping into the warmth of the living room. She looked at the fireplace, then at Sophie, who ran over to give her a shy hug. "I'm here to settle a debt of the heart." She handed the box to Lucas. Inside was a gold pilot's watch, but the inscription on the back brought a lump to his throat. "To the man who flies toward the storm so others can find their way home. My greatest asset." "Julian is in a private rehabilitation facility in Switzerland," Vespera said quietly, watching the flames. "He's lost his standing, but he's finally getting the help he didn't know he needed. As for me, I've stepped down as CEO. I realized I spent so much time looking at the world from 30,000 feet that I forgot how beautiful it looks from the ground. As we reach the end of our story, I want to ask you, if you lost everything tomorrow, who is the one person you'd want by your side in the storm? Tell us their name and why in the comments below." Lucas walked over to her, the space between them no longer a canyon of class and money, but a bridge of shared experience. He took her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "It's a good view from down here," he murmured, "if you're looking at the right things." Vespera looked up at him, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. "I think I'm finally looking at the right things, Lucas." Thank you for watching another story of Lucas to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as wild and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So like the video and subscribe for more, because Lucas and I will be waiting for you tomorrow.